We're looking at bilateral relationship, which has some relation to what's going on here in Brussels and with a different country right now, but we don't want to talk specifically about Brexit just yet, because it's easy to say all the things that are happening that are going well, and you've outlined a lot of these in particular, but probably we're going to learn more about how this relationship works by looking at things that are difficult to put together. In terms of the bilats, what has been most difficult to achieve and to really hold together?
Well, I think that the main issue of concern and of difficulty for both of us is the free movement of persons, no doubt. We have this agreement since 1999, entered into force I think 2003 or 4, and ever since the numbers of citizens of the European Union and EFTA countries too, by the way, coming into Switzerland has increased to the level I just described. And this, of course, you know, if you think of in terms of macroeconomics, it's fantastic. You know, you have good people coming in, you have the economy growing, even more people coming in, the economy growing, and could even argue that to some extent Switzerland went through the crisis other countries have known in Europe in the year 2000 and so on. Also thanks to this flow of good, well-educated people. But you reach a level where the infrastructure does not follow, where people feel themselves a little bit, you know, constrained in a labor market which is more competitive and so on. And so you have to deal with that. Perhaps we failed a little bit to deal with that, you know. We tried, and we still have them in place, to accompany this movement by what we call flanking measures, you know, making sure that there is no social dumping, salary dumping. We even went further with that after a constitutional vote was passed in Switzerland, introducing a kind of system by which you first look at people on your market if you have to fill the new positions before, you know, before requiring people to come from abroad. But the difficulty is to find a way to reassure your population, and I'm not talking about Swiss, but residing population, so the people which are in the country, with the fact that the market is an open one and over-border open one. So this was, I think, the main issue we had. Now the economy is growing in Europe too, so numbers are decreasing, the situation is coming down a little bit. But this phenomenon over the last 10, 15, 20 years was very present, and we still, I think, have to deal with that. This is one of the issues we still are discussing with the European Union in the framework of this institutional agreement, how we can make sure that by having homogeneity, we still are able to preserve some specificities of the labor market, which is a very specific one. You think geographically where we are. Perhaps in Luxembourg, we have the most posted workers, people coming in, and for sure we are one of the countries in Europe having more people having come in from abroad and living and residing in Switzerland.
Has there been a mood of nationalism which has challenged the relationship, the bilateral relationship with the European Union?
Well, I would say that generally speaking, how can I say, the Swiss are very pragmatic, so they look at the situation, they try and find solutions. There isn't much ideology when it comes to, you know, trying and find solutions to the problems. But having said that, I would not deny that in Switzerland, like in other countries around Europe, there is a growing sense of uneasiness about migration in general. And when you have that, then you tend to mix everything. You know, you don't make a distinction between the cross-border, you know, the French guy coming in, or the migrant coming from abroad, the asylum seeker, and so on. And when numbers increase, perception is reality, unfortunately. You know, in an uncontrolled manner, then you have these movements, you know, coming out and say, well, we first, and then we will see what happens.
And in this exactly this context, you had this initiative about Swiss laws, not foreign judges, as well.
Yeah.
And part of this perception was to look at where an agreement didn't really fit with what the Swiss people wanted to go to referendum, and if that referendum wasn't validated, the agreement would be withdrawn. Has this been tested yet?
No, well, perhaps a word so that you understand the constitutional setup. If you hear in this town that we are more complicated than others, this is not true. We are as complicated as anyone else. Our constitutional system is complicated. In our system, people can require 100,000 persons that the constitution is amended. Our constitution is very open. So 100,000 people, there is a vote. The majority of people and of the cantons accept the amendment. Well, the constitution is changed. What you're talking about is a vote we will have next Sunday about the fact that the constitution, Swiss constitution, should prevail over certain obligation of international law. I say certain because if an obligation under international law was subject to a popular vote, well, the constitutional amendment of next Sunday will not apply. So in an agreement like the institutional agreement we are negotiating, this provision will not apply. But more important than that, and I should also say that the government is against this proposal because it's a useless proposal. We have the constitutional, in our constitutional system, we have all what we need to take care of sometime really concrete and real difficulties in the relation between international law and national law and constitutional law. You know, you have plenty of libraries about that. We have the means to deal with that. So the government is saying this initiative is useless. But we will see what happens. In any case, it should not affect what we are doing here because it has nothing to do with that. It could affect, of course, the credibility of Switzerland because there are many agreements we conclude which are not subject to a popular vote, and they would be touched by this amendment. It has to do, I think, not only with constitutional, finesse, but also with what we were discussing before. You know, the fact that more and more some people are of the impression that they cannot decide anymore on their present and the future, that something above them is telling what they will have to do, and this is frightening. You know, this globalization, this uncontrolled opening. Which is very profitable, by the way, for every one of us. You know, I travel this day, train, aircraft, you go through, no controls, no hassle, much easier than 20 years ago. But to a certain extent, it's also frightening, you know, because they say, well, am I going to be able to control all that again?
But at the same time, you have some more flexibility. Now, you've got 120 bilateral agreements, you've got 25 committees working these things through. You're in the process of finding a new institutional framework as well. Is it easier to deal with that relationship on a bilateral basis rather than look at the whole package and say, we're not comfortable with this, we're off? Not pointing to any other country in particular.
I don't know, of course. I mean, being off is not an option. I mean, even if...
Seems to be an option for some.
Well, but if I may, I mean, I know what you're addressing there, but being off is not being off. So, no, being off is not an option. And even if you decide to be off, you are deciding not to be. So, the fact is, first of all, let's keep working what we have. Let's try and make it work better. If we cannot make it work better now, let's keep it at least, and then let's try it again later on. So, that's the philosophy. I understand that on the other side, you know, one moment we will probably be told, listen guys, okay, come again, but in some years because we have other things to do.
So is this a case of having your cake and eating it and putting half the cake in the fridge for later?
Yeah, but if you look at numbers, I mean, you cannot just think of stopping, you know, what do you stop? Just an example, 1.4 million European citizens, sorry, we are also European citizens, by the way, citizens of European Union living in Switzerland. Coordination of social security, okay? you stop having the agreement on free movement of persons, how you coordinate social security? What do you do with the pensions money they have been paying? Okay, what they have been paying, okay, it's there. But the future? How do you do that? You have to take out of I don't know, I don't know where they are. All bilateral agreements we concluded, you know, in the 50s and the 60s with all member states and see whether we can, you know, it's just not an option. So there is no way back, there is only a way forward.
And where's the pressure for the institutional framework? Where are you having to focus more of your attention because it's more problematic, more sensitive?
I would say it's the same, free movement of persons.
Okay.
Free movement of persons agreement is one of the market access agreements we have concluded with the European Union, which will be ruled, if you have a framework agreement, by this new agreement. And this institutional agreement foresees that there is an applicable law, which is mainly law of the European Union, but not only. There are also provisions we have decided upon bilaterally ourselves. It provides for a dynamic evolution of this law, of the acquis we have to integrate. It provides for the same application of the rules in both areas, and it provides for this settlement mechanism. Now, if we have specific solutions to make sure that the Swiss labor market, which is such under pressure, is not used for salary dumping, social dumping, we have to make sure that we preserve the system. And these are the difficulties, you know, because there you have, it's not a clash, but I mean, it's a difficulty between this idea of homogeneity, it's valid for everyone. You have a directive of posted workers, you have the implementing directive and so on, which we could, you know, receive in our system, but at the same time make sure that certain specificities are safeguarded. These are the difficulties, you know.
So for a country that's looking at this kind of approach, what would be the Swiss advice in terms of starting with? What's the general philosophy to get this right?
The general philosophy, I think, truly is the philosophy the European Union is trying to pursue with these new directives, implementing directives, new posted workers directive. This is the good way of doing things. But then every country might have some specificities. And you know better than me, you all work and live here. You know, you have a directive, which is a framework. Then you have national legislations, which must fit with the directive. But there you have some room for maneuvering. Now the question is how much? And we need a little bit more. If you look at where we are, we probably...
And do your European partners in the European Union, do the partners look at you with some sort of resentment or envy? How do you find the relationship? Is it careful?
No, I think that it's a quite fair point we are getting from neighbors, by the way. Is okay, fair enough, preserve the labor market, make sure that there is no social dumping, no salary dumping, but do not overrule that. Do not discriminate. Do not go over what you need to do in order to do that.
Just basic fairness.
Yes, and this is the difficulty, though, because you know what we think as being adequate probably is not what they think as being adequate. This is the difficulty of the negotiation.
And if we just look at a little bit of Brexit as well, you must look in awe at this process and what they're going through at the moment. What do you think is good in this process? What do you think would benefit the UK if it was to take a pragmatic approach and not an ideological approach?
Oh, but this is a you know, very dangerous question for me to answer. Are they taking an ideological approach? Really? I don't know. I mean, there is what you say, what you tell, there is what you do, there is what you negotiate, the text you are working on. First point I can make here, because this is the same in Switzerland. People have expressed their opinion. That's it. So in our system, we can ask people to express themselves several times. We can modify things and we can arrange them. We can take into account the reasons why a vote was rejected the first time or approved and so on. Here I have the impression it's a little bit more complicated. So we are used to these referenda initiatives and so on. There is room over the years to fine-tune. First point. The second is that if you accept that, people has the last word in such strategic decisions, then you have to act accordingly. And this does not mean that you don't have to tell people what the difficulties will be in acting accordingly. And this is what we also have to do in Switzerland, you know, accept the vote. You say, well, friends, but now we will have to deal with that and that. So I have no advice to give to Great Britain. I think that at the end of the day, and I tried to say it in my introductory remarks, what we need to have on this continent is, if possible, a system by which the European Union, EEA countries, Switzerland perhaps, UK, so though having perhaps different speeds or different, you know, setting, variable setting of cooperation, at least have a common goal in common. You know, it makes this continent so strong as possible, not only economically but also socially. And if this is reached at the end,
you must have some concerns that should an agreement fail, that Switzerland is going to suffer with its trade as well at the end of this. What's Switzerland doing to prepare for the end of March next year?
Yeah, well, we realized very quickly after June 16 that we had to deal with that. The government passed at that time, for once the Swiss were quite ironic, and a strategy we call it mind the gap. And we have been working with Great Britain on that informally first. You know, they are still a member state of the European Union. They are not allowed to conclude any treaties with anyone, but they are allowed to discuss, of course. And in the last months, they are even allowed to negotiate. So we have two strategies. The first is there is an agreement, a withdrawal agreement, and then we have more time to prepare for the future. In this case, we would actually continue what we have via the European Union in relation to UK. Makes sense. And if there is no agreement, if there is a cliff edge, then we need to have at least 4, 5, 6 major agreements replacing those in place. So we are ready, for instance, with an agreement on air transportation. It's a little bit easier, you know, because you have flights from Switzerland to UK.
Will your ambassador be sitting in London with his pen ready to sign that at the stroke of midnight?
Actually, this will probably be signed by a minister, you know, it's important enough. But there are 150 flights between Switzerland and UK daily, so it's very important. That's an easy issue, so to say. And then there are more complicated issues in the case of a cliff edge trade. Trade is an issue because we need a kind of triangulation with the European Union. Think of the accumulation of origin rules, you know, or the fact that you have goods going through out of Europe before reaching Switzerland. There are issues on migration. The example I made before with social security, with coordinations, but also with the fact that if there is a cliff edge, British citizens are third countries for a Schengen country like Switzerland. We are not in Schengen today, but you know, we need to know what will happen on visa. I don't think that there will be a visa requirement for British citizens, but you never know. There are the fact that they cannot come into Switzerland any more freely like they can today, because today they have the free movement of persons agreement. We have for third countries quotas. Naturally, we can extend quotas to the extent to cover all requests from Great Britain. No, there are 10,000 and more British citizens coming and going every year. So these are real issues. But we are dealing with that, and so we are preparing for fallback positions, hoping that we don't need them. I think that we will be ready by the end of the year. And then, and this is an important issue to know, the European Union will have to authorize Great Britain to sign this agreement with us.
Well, we'll take a couple of questions. If you just want to raise your hand, tell us who you are, where you're from. We've got a couple of microphones handy. Yeah. Gentleman here.
My name is Stefan Vision. State Secretary, you were speaking about inspiring options. Now in 2014, the Swiss people voted against free movement, even though we still have the free movement agreement. Now today, the EU and UK published a draft declaration on future relations between the EU and UK, which includes many fields of cooperation, free trade, transports, many things, but not free movement. So isn't it the other way around? And maybe at one point, politically, the inspiring option for Switzerland will be what we have seen published today, the draft declaration, because people in Switzerland, if you follow the vote, want exactly that. Thank you for answering the question.
Well, first of all, we did not vote against free movement of persons. We had an initiative, a constitutional initiative requiring the government to manage migration in an orderly way, meaning by that free movement is not managing migration by introducing quotas and maximum numbers in the interest of the economy, though, and so on. So it was a request for, how can I say, more structure rather than against free movement of persons. And we have found the way, because so we work to implement this constitutional requirement at the level of federal legislation in a way which is compatible with the agreement we have with the European Union on free movement of persons. So, and this is why we are convinced that we need free movement of persons. So we are not in the same situation Great Britain. On the contrary, we think that free movement of persons is a plus in our
When you say we, are you speaking about the government or the people?
I speak about Switzerland in general. We voted, apart from this initiative, we voted, I think, 4 times on free movement of persons. First time the agreement was concluded, then 7 years later when it was confirmed, and then the 2 subsequent enlargement of the European Union. Ambassador, you can correct me, but I think that 4 times. So it's the proof that the Swiss people are convinced that this is good for both of us, the European Union and Switzerland. Now, the second part of your remark, I haven't read the draft declaration I heard about today. This is a draft declaration on what will possibly happen in two years, 3, 4, I don't know, 2 years. So we have all that today. So why should we wait for something they might have in 2 years when we have all that today? We have that. We have to preserve that. We have to expand that. We have to make sure that it keeps going. Not hope for someone else to conclude something else. If Great Britain achieves to have a better deal, well, then we will look into that and perhaps see whether we can, in respect of this idea of homogeneity on the European continent, also take some profit. But for the time being, without any arrogance, because I know how difficult it is to deal with that. We have what we need.
Yeah, you seem very comfortable with the idea that everything's adjustable as necessary over time, that you're not fixed with a position which is untenable for the population.
Yeah, I think that that's the nature of my job and of my, my spirit.
Another question? So, yeah, you have a microphone there? Tell us who you are, where you're from.
Borderlex, a trade policy publication. I was wondering, you mentioned earlier issues that have nothing to do with bilateral relations creating irritants, and the main discussion was free movement. I have something a bit more mundane, but has to do with the trade wars that are going on. The EU has introduced safeguarding measures on steel, I understand that affects Switzerland quite a lot, the collateral victim of this whole thing. Yeah. Is this really a problem at the moment as part of your negotiations with the EU, and how wouldn't it have been? It's also, I think, if Switzerland had been in EEA, it probably would have been exempted from these safeguards. So can you explain to us what's going on and how is this disturbing also the bilateral relationship?
Okay. Yes, well, yes, I can give you my point of view. You should ask this question to the European Commission, but it is true. The reactions of the European Union to American sanctions affect Switzerland as a collateral damage, and the European Union has exempted EEA countries on reasons which are difficult to understand for us, because if you look at the integration of the market we have precisely in goods, probably Switzerland the same level as any European area agreement country. But you can have a more formal way of answering this question. That agreement is a comprehensive agreement. Our agreements are bilateral and therefore not comprehensive, and so might be a good point. So, legally speaking, is a difficult question. We have attacked American sanctions, safeguard measures at the WTO. We haven't done that against the European Union, because we are still confident that in the framework of what we are trying and doing, to improve the relations based on a new framework agreement, we might find a way out of that. It's an irritant. It affects quite heavily the Swiss export industry, and it's even more absurd that I don't have the numbers in mind, but I think that most of trade affected is a come-and-go trade. So the pieces coming in, being elaborated, coming out, and being sanctioned. So it really doesn't make any sense economically. There is a legal issue. Perhaps we are stuck in there. Would be nice, to perhaps go over this legal issue and think of what we have built together, what we still are trying to do. We made the point many times, what not possible yet.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Yeah. Gentleman here. Tell us who you are, please.
Yes, my name is Remo Hess. I work for Swiss newspapers, Luzerner Zeitung and Aargauer Zeitung here in Brussels. Mr. Balzaretti, the framework negotiations are now going on for years. Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker set already several deadlines. The Swiss always manage to circumvent the deadlines. Can you promise that...
I say something like that. Sorry, to interrupt you, but I mean, they set deadlines and we circumvent deadlines? Would you like a deadline? Sorry, would you like to have yourself a deadline? You know what deadline means?
Deadline?
Come on, sorry, I interrupted you. But.
Okay, but you don't agree that there has been several deadlines, or no?
I have never been told about a deadline myself.
Okay, okay. So, but the Commission...
I'm still alive, as you can see.
But, okay. So, anyways, in general, can you promise that, or can you... will there soon be some decision time, or will these negotiations maybe go on forever?
I don't think that I have to promise anything here, but we have been saying many times, first of all, that we are negotiating in good faith, that we have made good progress, I think, in the last months, and that we will be able to conclude an agreement. I mean, by concluding an agreement, to having our government approve this agreement when the agreement is good enough to be concluded. If it is not good enough to be concluded, we will not be able to conclude it. And no government on earth would accept an agreement which is not, let's not say sure, but likely sure to pass before Parliament and so on.
I can think of one government, actually.
Huh?
I can think of one government that's just concluded an agreement.
But they might be convinced to be able to pass it through Parliament. In our system, this is even more complicated, as you know, because after Parliament, there will very likely be a referendum against this agreement, so a popular vote and so on. So very cautious, voila. It takes two to tango, that's true. If at some point the European Union does not want to negotiate anymore because, considers that there's nothing more to negotiate, fair enough, that we will have to accept. But for the time being, I think that we are still discussing ways to conclude this agreement, and this is good so, because the more you discuss, the nearer you come, and at one point our government will have to decide whether this is good enough or not. But I cannot promise you anything.
Thank you. Another question? Any other questions there? Yeah, gentleman at the back there, please.
Thomas Miglierina, Swiss Radio State Secretary. How is the fact that now we know the Brexit agreement, that this agreement is public, how does that impact your job in Switzerland? And without wanting to underestimate your creativity and the creativity of the European side, can this agreement be substantially different, the future framework agreement between Switzerland and the EU, can it be that different from what we have seen in the Brexit agreement. In the Brexit agreement, there is a arbitration panel, there are norms on state aid, there are norms on competitions, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Well, again, as I said in my introductory remarks, at the end of the day, I think that it is in the interest of everyone on the European continent to have the homogeneity which is required for the market to function properly. But this being said, you know, we are not Great Britain, so Norway is not Switzerland, and so on. So within this general framework, there is room for specificities, and these are also the difficult things to negotiate, of course, you know, because you are to some extent derogating from general rules. But as far as these derogations are reasonable and justified, they might be possible, and that's what we are doing. So I think that yeah, yes and no. So both what you're saying is true. Generally speaking, it will be like that, but I can reassure you that what we are trying and doing in our bilateral negotiations takes into account the specificity of the bilateral relation.
Switzerland isn't a small player. This is something I think a lot of people underestimate. They look at territorially the size of Switzerland, and they can't imagine the volume of trade that Switzerland does with the EU, with the UK, and vice versa. This is a huge market. Yeah.
No, I agree, and this is why I insist so much always when I have this kind of debates on these facts and figures, because it might seem a little bit boring, but you know, 1 billion per day in goods is huge, and do not forget the European Union earns as an average of 40 billions in trade with Switzerland, a surplus of 40 billions in goods, and more or less the same in services. So it's a huge market for
European. A lot of leverage as well.
Sorry?
You have a lot of leverage in negotiation then as well.
Well, there is some, yes. And this is why we are still discussing. You know?
What about the stock market as well? In you were talking about the second contribution. I read about this, the second contribution, and some within Switzerland wanted to see the Swiss stock market treated on par with European stock markets. Is that correct?
This is something that happened last year around this time. So it was December 17, after you know, our objective tests in order to acknowledge that the Swiss stock market system is equivalent in, you know, I don't understand a thing about that, but it must be organized in the same way as the European stock exchanges. Objectively, this is the case. And this is a requirement under MiFIR, the European regulation, and especially MiFIR 23, that's the article of the regulation. Everyone in Switzerland knows MiFIR 23, that's amazing. So, it's like EuGH in Germany is European Court of Justice. You say EuGH in Switzerland, MiFIR 23, everyone says, I know what you're talking about. They don't know, of course, but the fact is that last year the European Commission proposed to member states to limit this acknowledgement of equivalence for 1 year. And this was perceived in Switzerland as a declaration of war, because the same day the European Commission gave Hong Kong and other jurisdictions an unlimited equivalence. And after that, and these are, you know, more or less official statements. I'm not inventing anything. We were told that, you know, this equivalence is in danger if there aren't any tangible progresses in the institutional framework negotiation. Might well be that you will not be considered as being equivalent in the future. It has triggered in Switzerland a reaction, a legal one. So we will have, if you are not considered equivalent as for January 1st, 19, have the same system in Switzerland. So the European Stock Exchange will not be considered as being equivalent in Switzerland.
They should have thought of that before they made the threat, don't you think?
Yeah, but I mean, this is a lose-lose situation, really. And it makes no sense because financial markets do not work like that. So this measure, which was a political one, is a political one. I'm not saying it's not allowed to take political measures, but nothing to do with what we are discussing here. And this is another irritant. This is why I was saying that we hope that by conducting this negotiation in the way we are conducting them, to achieve this sufficient progress in order for the European Commission to acknowledge that and say, okay, let's see, MIFIR is okay, and you know, they can revoke this this equivalence decision anytime after. So I hope very much.
It would be a sign of good faith if they did revoke it, wouldn't it?
No.
Okay. Yeah, any other questions? Okay. While you're thinking of other questions, there's a lot written about the cohesion and Switzerland's contribution to European cohesion. Is this just buying market access, or do you really benefit from this policy?
No, I think that the idea of Switzerland participating in the social and economic cohesion of the European continent is both an act of solidarity, at least it was 10 years ago, and of, I can say that very clearly, of self-interest, you know, because the more Europe is homogeneous, the better it is for all of us. This was the idea of this first program. We were required, also as constitution and you know and sensitivities in Switzerland, not to pay into funds of the European Union, but to have programs in the recipient countries ourselves. And so we had a memorandum of understanding with the European Union at that time, and then concluded bilateral agreements with the countries, the 10 first, and then the 2, and then Croatia at least. And what we will now do is to renew this scheme and have a second contribution and focus on other issues. So we are focusing on dual education, focusing on health, and for the first time we are also intending to have about 200 million in migration programs, also in countries which are not cohesion countries of the European Union. So Italy and Greece, and perhaps joint programs in third countries to help deal with the migration issues. This project is now in Parliament. It will be dealt with by the upper chamber of Parliament before Christmas, and in the lower chamber in March. But I have some doubts that Parliament will pass a 1.4 billion bill if the European Commission considers the Swiss Stock Exchange as not being equivalent. They say, well, they are making our life impossible, and we should pay them 1.4 billion. It's not the opinion of the government. The government has passed this project, this bill, to Parliament. We went forward. We decided to do that. It's in the interest of everyone. It's good. But you know, politics is something else.
When you talk about these programs, does the Swiss government get to choose which programs it wants, or does the European Union suggest and give you a menu?
No, they are not giving a menu. What we will do this time again is to conclude a memorandum of understanding with the European Union, so to make sure that what we intend to do fits generally in the idea, avoid duplications, perhaps fill some gaps, but then we will negotiate with individual countries what we do and what suits them more than what we could try and have in a general scheme.
It doesn't seem to me, you don't seem to get very much back for 200 million invested in migration. How do you make the calculation in terms of where the money should be spent? What's important to Switzerland?
It's a good question. Perhaps I don't have the adequate answer now, but I think that we will try, precisely with Italy, Greece, perhaps Spain, to see whether there are some specific projects we can finance with this money where we are good. So I don't know, dealing with children, with migrant children, dealing with centers of schooling, or vocational training in centers where people are just waiting, to know what the future will be. So very specific programs. The amounts are not huge, but also with few money you can be very effective if you are focused on what you do.
Okay, another question? Yeah, go ahead. Tell us who you are, where you're from, please.
Florence Autrey from La Tribune de Genève. This week, the Austrian Chancellor said that the technical negotiations were finished, that it was done, and that it was time for a political decision. And it has always been said that there might be a window of opportunity for political decisions between now, let's say, and early December, when Switzerland might trigger the so-called countermeasures to protect its stock exchange. So are technical negotiations finished, really? And do you expect, should we expect that the Federal Council uses this window of opportunity to put a deal on the table and decide something before equivalence vanishes?
Okay, but I will start with the last part of your question. This legislation we have prepared to apply countermeasures, if you want, the stock exchange. It's legislation which is conditional to what the European Union will do, and it will enter into force on 1st of January 19. So if in between there is a positive decision by the European Commission on the Swiss stock equivalence, this piece of legislation will not apply to the European Union. So it will be without object. We needed to have it in place these days because of technical reasons. You have to prepare yourself, you have to know what to do, you need a month in advance. But it will deploy no effects if there is a positive equivalence decision. Now, the other part of the question, so it's without object because, I've covered it. But technical negotiations, it's the way you define that. You always need to fine-tune things. There are still a couple of issues we can negotiate at technical level, even though they are of political importance. And then, yes, then it is true what Mr. Kunz said, and he said that after having spoken to our president, I was there, is that after that, these last things we still need to sort out, will be time for political decisions. That's true. When? I don't know, because I'm not setting the agenda of the government. They will decide when they think that they can and want to decide.
Thank you. Another question? They're coming close to our time. If you have a pressing question, let us know. The future of Europe is a big discussion. And you're not exactly an innocent bystander on the edge of this as well. And we have elections coming up next year.
Yeah.
Do you see there's a risk that the tonality of discussion will change, that there'll be harder edges to it, or are you confident that the bilateral process will give you sufficient flexibility to be able to deal with this in a reasonable manner?
Listen, I'm not only pragmatic, I'm also a reasonable person. If you look at the no, but if you look at the importance of this relation, if you look at the really the win-win situation we are in, and you forget for a while of some difficulties we have, we will find a way. We've always found a way. I cannot imagine that changes in the political environment would change that situation, because these are facts. And this being said, I don't know how big the changes will be in European Parliament and Commission. I have no idea. In Europe, a little bit like in Switzerland, you might have shifts in some countries, but then, all in all, quite stable situation. So I guess it will more or less the same. What's sure is that the trend we are seeing is a trend towards, at the same time, more core integration on certain issues, and perhaps a little bit more flexibility on other issues. If this is the case, I think that we will find our way with the European Union as we found it the last 50 years.
Okay, and just as I was beginning to wrap up, in the UK, I'm Irish, so I can sort of take an impersonal view. In the UK, referenda is a bad word now, and yet you guys do this all the time. What's the secret of success for holding referendum?
Well, first of all, everything we do with popular votes is not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up. People request can request that there is a popular vote. It's very rarely the fact of the government. It is the fact of not the government, of the constitution by very important treaties. For instance, if we would become a member of the European Union, that would be a compulsory referendum. But for all other issues, people decide. You know, you have legislation approved by parliament, you have international treaties passed by government, approved by parliament, that can be challenged by people. And so it's never a problem, you know, because it's not the fact of the government, of the sovereign, it's a fact of people wanting to express themselves.
But you do it so frequently that if it fails one time,
yes,
you have the opportunity to bring it back, and it's not so dramatic. Is this a lesson that the rest of Europe can learn?
No, I'm not giving any lessons to anyone, but, you know, bottom up is generally speaking and in long term better than top down.
Okay, and I'll add one final quote that you gave today as well, is that we always find a way, there's a way to get it done.
Yes.
Roberto Balzaretti, thank you so much.
My pleasure, thank you.